Today we have distinguished author William Davis with us, the author of latest book, Crucible of Command, and we are delighted to have you with Rodera.
Well, thank you. I'm very happy to be with you today.
Thank you. Crucible of Command is a serious research work, and probably it has taken decades to put it all together. Would you explain to our readers what the book is all about and what aspects of the Civil War and the personalities it touches that was not covered before?
Well, it's really the goal is to deal with the development, the origins and development of the personalities of Generals U.S. Grant and Robert E. Lee. It's not a set biography of each of the two of them in the conventional sense, so I don't spend a whole lot of time through the minutiae of their battlefield movements and that sort of thing. I'm much more interested in what created the kind of men they were, the experiences they had in their pre-Civil War life, and how those experiences informed the kind of decisions they made when they were put in positions of high command where they had enormous responsibility. There's several things are kind of surprising. One was, for me, was to find out how very similar they were in many ways. Also to discover things about their personality that I think even longtime students may not appreciate. For instance, that Grant was an incurable optimist. He always expected things to work out for the best, and no matter how many times he met setbacks, he continued to go through life with that same approach. Whereas Lee was very reserved, almost pessimistic at times, a man not entirely happy with his life, with what he'd achieved, a man who often felt like a failure in spite of all that he did in his life. So on both sides, there were a number of surprises in the course of doing the book, which in fact took about 3 years to research and write. But of course, I've had 40 years of experience behind that to be thinking about them.
Would you explain a little bit, because you've done a lot of work in putting this together, that what early years of these two personalities kind of formed their character and got them to the places that they ultimately ended up having huge responsibilities?
Sure. Lee's is probably the most complicated. He was the son of a hero of the American Revolution. His father was General Light Horse Harry Lee, George Washington's very successful cavalry commander. But after the war, Light Horse Harry Lee was pretty much a failure as a man and as a businessman, and certainly as a husband and father. He lost the family fortune. He wound up spending time in debtor's prison. He may not have been that faithful to Lee's mother, and in fact, he simply abandoned the family and fled the country when Robert E. Lee was about 8 years old, because he was being pursued by creditors. So Robert E. Lee never saw his father again alive after about the age of 8. And his father's disappearance left Lee as virtually the man of the house. He suddenly, at the age of 8 and 9, had to take on responsibility for helping his mother look after his sisters and another brother, for helping to look after his mother herself, who was pretty much an invalid much of the time. He had responsibility for managing the household, for shopping, for things like that, all at the same time that he was trying to go to school. And I think the result for Lee was that he never really got to be a boy. His childhood ended at about age 8, and he had thrust upon him this enormous responsibility on top of the responsibility of being a Lee, one of the best names in Virginia, and feeling that he had somehow to make up for the shame that his father had brought on the family name. So that produced in Lee a young man, as he grew up, almost oppressed by a sense of duty and responsibility of how he ought to act as a Lee, a man constantly conscious that other people might be judging him. And as a result, he really didn't always get to be just the person he really was inside. He had to maintain a public facade virtually all of his life. And that certainly will have an influence in his military career And then when the Civil War comes and he winds up being an important general and finally the General-in-Chief of Confederate armies, he still has to maintain this pose because he's now standing for the dignity of the Confederacy as well. Grant's an entirely different story. He grew up in the wealthiest household in town, in his small hometown in Ohio. His father was a very well-to-do man. They lived in the nicest house in town. Grant's problem with his father is that his father was an overbearing braggart who was a constant embarrassment to Grant and other members of the family at times. But at the same time, his father gave him enormous freedom, a freedom that Lee never had. By the time Lee left for West Point to pursue his military academy studies, he hadn't probably traveled more than 50 miles from Alexandria, Virginia in his whole life. But Grant, doing jobs for his father's business, actually traveled, I figure, somewhere around 1,500 to 2,000 miles by himself, taking the family's business wagons out to buy produce or to trade goods and back, taking enormous responsibility, but at the same time having real adventure. The result being that Grant was always fascinated by travel. He always wanted to see new places that he hadn't been. And things went well for the Grant family, and that helped to instill in him, I think, this feeling of optimism that I mentioned before, that everything would go well, that almost anything could be done. The result is that when presented with big challenge in later years, Lee would be slow to decide just what he felt could be accomplished, whereas Grant would just always go into things assuming that he could do anything he chose. So these experiences helped to produce two very different men.
They both ended up facing each other, and they were probably one of their best opponents in their lives when leading the two largest armies at the time in the country. In the later years, after the war was over, was there any healthy respect between the two, or they kept continuing to disregard each other's achievement in some ways?
They, as near as we can tell, they really only met 4 times in their lives. They met once in 1848 in Mexico City because both of them were officers in the American Army that had invaded Mexico, though they didn't become friends. Lee really never remembered that meeting. It's interesting that Grant never forgot it, because at that time the young Robert E. Lee was the officer that all other Army's officers looked up to. They met again the second time at Appomattox on April 9th, 1865. It's 151 years ago tomorrow. Of course, for Lee to surrender to Grant. They met again the next day to discuss some further details. And only once after that, and that's shortly after Grant became president, they were both oddly reticent about what they thought about each other. Lee never really maintained that Grant was the greatest or the most skillful Union general that he faced. He always said the best general he faced was George B. McClellan. But, of course, he always beat McClellan on the field. So Lee could be telling himself he'd thus beaten the best. But Grant does much the same. He never gives Lee a lot of credit as a great commander, just that he's a competent commander. There was respect between them. After the war, when Lee applied for a pardon, and there were those in the Union government who wanted to prosecute Lee for treason, Grant went to Washington and met with President Andrew Johnson and essentially stood up to him and told him he would grant Lee a pardon or Grant would resign his commission as General-in-Chief of the Union armies, which would have been enormously embarrassing for the president. So Grant stood by Lee when he had the power to do him a favor. Grant certainly realized that after the war, Lee was, just by the fact of who he was, easily the most influential man in the entire South. And Grant did, on one occasion, approach Lee. That's when he had him come to the White House, to try to get Lee to speak out publicly to help endorse moderate candidates for the governorship in in Virginia and a moderate new constitution for the state of Virginia. But Lee was reluctant ever to speak out in the public forum. But Grant certainly respected Lee's prestige, even if he was frustrated that Lee wouldn't use it the way Grant wanted him to. For his part, Lee is very silent about what he thought of Grant after the war, though he did bear him, I think, at least some grudging respect for the generous terms that Grant gave him in the surrender of his army at Appomattox.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You have discovered some substantial and new evidence on both men, and there were surprisingly similarities between the two. If you would care to bring up those similarities.
Well, sure. There are a number of similarities. Cosmetically, on the outside, they look different. Their personalities may seem rather different, but at bedrock, there is great similarity between them. First and foremost, they were both bold men. They were willing to take huge risks as commanders, and unlike so many in the military, they were willing to take upon themselves the responsibility if something they tried failed. They both pretty much made their plans on their own. They might listen to the opinions of others, but at the end of the day, they made their decisions themselves, and that way, if something went wrong, there was no one else to share responsibility with them. They took it on themselves. And they had that very difficult element to find in any leader, which is they were willing to take the big risk and still go to sleep at night. Grant and Lee both on the battlefield, things would go wrong for them from time to time. Both would be surprised occasionally by the enemy on the battlefield, but they reacted in exactly the same way. Their reaction was essentially to say to themselves, well, this isn't good, but now how can I do something to turn this around to make it work to my advantage? They weren't the kinds of generals who went into a campaign planning on how they would retreat if beaten. They went in expecting to win, and most often, certainly, they did. They were good at fostering able subordinates and spotting intelligent and capable younger officers, and neither seems to have had any problem with conceit or ego, one of the most difficult things for military commanders to try to deal with. They didn't mind if someone else got the credit for something that they proposed themselves. They realized their job was to go out and bring their nation victories. Their job was not to go out and puff up their own egos. So they don't engage in the kinds of quarrels and squabbles that so many other Army commanders in that time got engaged in. And above all, they both realized that they were generals in constitutional democracies in which the civil authority was supreme. So they did not challenge their presidents or the civil government. They realized they were servants, not masters. And that's something that even today, major Army commanders sometimes never quite understand.
Also, their ethical and moral compasses, there were also some similarities and differences there as well. If you would explore that as well.
Sure. They're both apparently rather modest men. They both appear to be chaste men. There's not a hint in either case of anything like marital infidelity. They were pretty much devoted to their wives from the time they became engaged until their deaths. It was easy for Grant. He was just head over heels in love with his wife, Julia, and was never happier than when she was with him. It was harder for Lee because his wife, rather quickly after their marriage, began to show some signs of being emotionally erratic. Possibly today she might have been diagnosed as being bipolar. She would do very bizarre things. She could be very difficult to live with at times. But Lee stuck by her, nevertheless, right up to his death. They, as I said before, they both had a high respect for democracy itself. Neither one of them had within him the wherewithal to become a military dictator. They believed in the democracy of their time. They just had different views as to what the future of that democracy might be. Both men are very ethical, which it sounds a bit corny perhaps to today's ears, but in their times this was very important to people, to be seen as ethical, to do the right thing in any circumstances. And what you find is that both of them do that. I find almost no instances of meanness or selfishness or dishonesty or deceitfulness in them. And there aren't many people who can say they haven't at one time or another had little episodes of any of those things in their lives. If there were episodes of those things in these men's lives, it simply didn't make it into the records that are left behind for us as we try to put together the stories of their lives.
And how were their political and military worlds were similar or different that they were facing as they were leading the two large armies?
They did face different challenges, and Lee's was perhaps the more difficult, setting aside the fact that Lee, of course, is fighting for the Confederacy and is therefore an underdog. He will almost always be outnumbered and certainly always outclassed in the material support necessary to keep armies moving. But Grant had the great benefit of having a commander-in-chief, Abraham Lincoln, who was, I think, a brilliant, instinctive, natural-born chief executive. Lincoln did not micromanage. Lincoln understood that he didn't know much about the military, and he would defer to generals who communicated with him and who brought him victories. Lincoln could be very easy to get along with, and even though Grant and Lincoln never really met until early 1864, they formed immediately a very good working relationship that by the time of Lincoln's assassination in 1865 really had some affection behind it, to the point that Grant would revere Lincoln for the rest of his life. Lee, on the other hand, had to deal with President Jefferson Davis, who was a good man and certainly knew and understood the military very well. But he had the instincts of a bureaucrat, not the instincts of a chief executive. He would micromanage. He wanted to insert himself into almost everything, especially relating to the military. And he had a very prickly personality, which meant he was in one feud after another with one general after another throughout the war. Lee, to his great credit, understood that his job was to go out and win victories. His job was not to feud with the president. And so Lee went out of his way to make a relationship between the two of them that worked, and it worked very well. And I think virtually all the credit goes to Lee. He kept Davis informed. He didn't challenge him. Sometimes he certainly flattered him, not in order to gain something for Lee himself, but in order to keep the president off his back. And the result is that whereas several other Army commanders in the Confederacy spent more time fighting Jefferson Davis than they did fighting Union armies, Lee always had Davis's strength behind him rather than in front of him. Lee stayed out of politics almost entirely during the war. He did not trust politicians. He once said that politicians were the most difficult to cure of all insane people. Grant, I think, didn't have a much better view of politicians, and he stayed out of politics as well, though he was aided by the fact that he was kind of adopted by a few Illinois politicians who made it their business to try to advance his career. And indeed they did, though Grant won promotion fair and square by his deeds and not just by who he knew. They both understood that the politics back home in Washington and in Richmond were often unseemly, violent morasses of conflicting ambitions and schemes, and they knew military men were better off to stay out of that. Indeed, even today, military men sometimes don't understand that they're better off staying out of Washington politics.
Absolutely. The Crucible of Command, when you in the book, a lot of new evidence was discovered. What did you have to go through to discover that evidence, and how did you find that?
Well, there's an enormous array of sources available on both of these men, but there still is almost always more to find. For instance, in the case of Lee's education, we have always known that he went to the Alexandria Academy, which was kind of like a private elementary or junior high school. But we haven't known much more than that. In fact, by working in the still existing newspapers at the time, I was able to determine that Lee, in fact, attended 2 or 3 academies in Alexandria, and also able to determine that he was not an outstanding student, since they would publish in the newspapers every quarter the lists of the honor students, and Lee's name was never on those lists. Doesn't mean he was a bad student, it just didn't mean that he was an outstanding student. And how could he be when you consider all the responsibility he had helping to run his family's home? He had too many distractions. It's often been assumed, indeed it's an old cliche, that when Lee went to West Point, to the U.S. Military Academy, that he was the only cadet in its history ever to go for 4 years and graduate without getting one demerit. That is, one black mark against his name for behavior or whatever. That's just been accepted as fact for generations. But the fact is, he's not in his own graduating class. There were 5 other cadets who also had no demerits. And it happened with 2 or 3 cadets on average every year. Mm-hmm. So that's not to downplay Lee's capability. As a student, he graduated second in his class, and he should have been first in his class, but wasn't. And I think the fact is he did not get any demerits, but that hardly made him unique. Somehow that myth has attached itself to his reputation then and since. With Grant, probably the biggest myth about Grant is the one thing that most Americans think they know about him, which, of course, is that he was a drunkard, which is just not true. It's all based on allegations made 60 years after the fact, often by people who had grudges against Grant because of wartime issues when they thought he didn't help them get promotions they wanted and that sort of thing, or people who were politically opposed to him. In fact, in his own time, you cannot find anything that ever accuses him of having too much to drink, except perhaps once in Mexico. The fact is, Grant got drunk very easily. Only 1 or 2 drinks would do that to him, but he was aware of that, and consequently he avoided drinking as much as he could. And if he had 3 or 4 lapses during the course of the war, it was usually when he was bored, when there was nothing happening on the battlefield, and when his wife Julia was not with him. If Julia was with him, she was his touchstone. She always kept him on an even keel when they were together. Theirs probably is one of the best marriages we have ever had in the White House. There are more materials about Lee coming to light all the time. Well, shortly before I wrote this book, a number of his personal letters to members of the family finally became available. They'd been in family hands all along. And every now and then, the Grant descendants still produce another letter or 2 that no one really knew about. So these sources keep coming out, and I'm sure that 2 or 3 years from now, someone doing research on Grant or Lee will be able to discover more new things that I didn't find. No one ever gets to find everything. What a historian has to do is make the very best effort he or she can to find as much as possible. And that's the great fun of history. Is it's rather like being Christopher Columbus, going out in hopes of discovery.
Mm-hmm. And Lee was also a religious man, and Lee also did not share the segregationist strong views that were held by Jefferson Davis.
Lee was somewhat religious, but early on in his life, but never really showed much interest in it, at least not based on his letters. When he was engaged to his future wife, she she constantly was kind of nagging him, trying to get him to be more religious, to go to church, to read Scripture. And in one of his letters, he responded to her, she must stop trying to convert him. I am the same bad old Robert I have always been and always will be. But perhaps during the war with Mexico, perhaps with the death and the destruction that he saw there, he experienced some kind of an epiphany. And as a result, from about 1850 onward, Lee shows increasing signs of being very religious indeed, and in becoming what you might call a providentialist. That is, one who believed that man is helpless on earth. God determines everything. We have no control over our lives. Everything that happens is because God wills it. And that indeed life is not on earth is not meant to be necessarily pleasant, but it may just be one case of having to endure hardship after another until you die and go to heaven, and then in heaven you'll be happy. It's not a real uplifting religious viewpoint. But on the other hand, if God is responsible for everything, that can be very liberating to an army commander who's outnumbered by the enemy. It could mean to Lee that he could take a big chance, because if God willed that it work, then it would work. If it didn't fail, then it wasn't so much his failure as it was God's decision that it was not right. Lee was not anti-slavery. This is something that's been greatly misinterpreted for years and years. He did not like the idea of slavery, but it was a fact that people in America, and especially the South, were simply faced with when they were born. It had been in existence for 200 years by the time Lee was born, and he did not see any way that man was going to be able to end slavery. Lee did not particularly like Negroes. He didn't like slaves. He didn't like free Negroes. He didn't need slaves, for one thing. Military officers didn't. He owned no property. The slaves that he had were inherited from his mother, and they were household slaves mostly. But his experience when he was helping his mother run affairs is that slaves ran away, and it cost money to send slave catchers after them to bring them back. Slaves lied. Slaves stole. Slaves were lazy. They didn't work hard. They were more trouble than they were worth. And Lee in 1858 would actually say that slavery was an evil, but it was a greater evil for the white man than for the black man, because the white master was saddled with taking care of the slaves. And he didn't think anybody but God would ever be able to end slavery, which if the only people on, if God's agents on earth are men, then somehow or other men are going to have to do it. But Lee just didn't see how they would. Grant's, in many ways, a very opposite character. He's completely silent about slavery, really, until the middle part of the war. We don't know how he felt about it. We do know that he did own one slave. A slave was given to him by his father-in-law when his father-in-law gave him a farm in Missouri. The farm failed, and Grant was broke. He could have sold that slave for maybe $1,000 or more, money he very much needed. But instead, he freed the slave. So, but we don't know if that means Grant was really anti-slavery or what. There's no explanation given by him for that. But we do know that as the war went on, and especially after the Emancipation Proclamation, Grant more and more absorbed what he believed Lincoln's ideology was with regard to slavery, and Grant became more and more determined to see slavery ended. And after the war, he became more and more determined as General-in-Chief and then as President to see that the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution that were to guarantee former slaves equal rights and the vote and more, to make sure that those things, in fact, were honored, which sadly was not the case after he left office. But he became very committed to the advancement of the freedmen.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. From the military strategy perspective, were there any similarities and differences in how they approached the war and how they sized up each other in terms of resources, in terms of the ultimate outcome? Because South was very dependent on its export of cotton to the foreign land, and And obviously, Grant made a decision that war could be easily won, or relatively easily won, by controlling the rivers and the ports.
Right. Grant saw early on the essential military strategy that was best suited to defeating the Confederacy. And as you've just said, that was gaining control of the rivers, especially the western rivers, the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers, and using them to send military forces on naval vessels far up into the heartland of the Confederacy, and then thereby to cut up the Confederacy into smaller and smaller pieces to be devoured individually, at the same time that a blockade on the entire Confederate coastline from Virginia all the way to Texas would prevent the importation of the munitions necessary to keep the Confederate war effort going. The Confederacy was not an industrial nation. It could produce cannon, it could produce guns, it certainly could produce ammunition, but never in significant quantities. Most everything had to be brought through the blockade from foreign nations. And if the Union Navy could interdict, could prevent that blockade running, it could seriously hamper the Confederate war effort. And it was slow to be effective, but in the end, that blockade became very effective. And at the same time, as you said, it also helped to prevent the South from getting goods out, goods like cotton and other things, over to foreign nations to use in payment for munitions and weapons. It was called derisively the Anaconda Plan, but that in a way is what it was, that the Confederacy would be surrounded by Union forces on water, on the rivers and on the ocean, and that they would just slowly constrict and squeeze the life out of the Confederacy, just as the anaconda would squeeze the breath and life out of its prey. And it worked. Otherwise, on the battlefield itself, Grant and Lee, again, are really quite similar. They're both men who are, to some extent, raiders. Rather than meeting an enemy army head-on, nose to nose, it is always their preference, if possible, to somehow get around one side, one flank or the other of an enemy army, to strike fear into the army by threatening to cut off its line of communications or retreat, and thereby to force the enemy army either to pull back or to divide itself so that they could then begin to carve up the enemy army in pieces. And this worked time and again for Grant at Fort Donelson. It worked for Grant at Vicksburg. It'll work for him in a way when he's facing Lee in Virginia in 1864. And of course, Lee's flanking movements are famous, none more so than when he sent Stonewall Jackson and almost half of Lee's army on a flanking march around the Federals at Chancellorsville and won one of the most stunning victories, really, of the war. Neither one of them really likes frontal assaults. They both seem to understand that modern weaponry, as of the 1860s, plus the use of defensive works, had pretty much made the frontal assault, the bayonet assault, passé, out of date, because the firepower could be so great it was just devastating to armies. And both of them actually only ever engaged in one or two instances in which they launched frontal assaults, and it proved to be costly to them both times. They were just acts of desperation, I think. Otherwise, the way they approached a campaign was to marshal, to bring together as much as they could in the material resources they were going to need, so that their men were fed, so that their ammunition belts were full, so that they were well uniformed and equipped, and so that they were well led by competent officers. And then to move forward, they both believed strongly in every effort of preparation, and at the same time tried as much as possible to anticipate any contingency or any act by the enemy that they would have to counter. You could never do that all the time, of course, and they were both marvelously gifted at responding to the unexpected from the other side.
You have a long and distinguished career in researching and focusing on the Civil War and the history. How did you get interested in it, and what brought you into that sphere?
Oh boy, that goes back a long ways. I was born in Independence, Missouri, which is just outside Kansas City. That area was largely settled by people from the South in the early 1800s. And as a result, when the Civil War came along, that part of Missouri was deeply divided. And indeed, I had ancestors on both sides of the war, some in the Union Army, some in the Confederate Army. So it was still something of a lively topic when I was a child in Missouri. And that may be why I got interested in the Civil War, I think, knowing that I had ancestors involved in it. And then, I guess in college, I just began to feel the urge to write. I always enjoyed research, and that is still the real fun of history. Naturally, you've got to write something from it in order to make that research worthwhile. But the research is always, that's where all the thrills are, when you turn a page and suddenly see something that no one's seen before, or a document you've been looking for many years. And that determined me to decide to research and write as much as I could. And I've been doing it now for going close to 45 years or thereabouts. And it's just gotten to be more fun the longer I've done it. I would love to keep doing it for another 100 years, but I may not get a chance to. I was very lucky to, the first time I published my first article when I was 19. Published an article in a historical magazine, and I was in college at the time. It was a brief profile of a man named John C. Breckinridge, who was our youngest vice president in history. He was only 35 when he was elected, and that's the youngest you can be. But then he later wound up becoming a Confederate general, and I got sort of interested in what would make a U.S. vice president become seemingly the ultimate traitor by becoming a Confederate general. And that article got seen by some descendants of the Breckinridge family, who asked me if I would consider writing a biography of him. And they turned over to me 2 steamer trunks full of his papers that had been in an attic in West Virginia for 100 years, and no one had ever looked in them. So I got to play Christopher Columbus big time. And that really launched the career of writing, was the Breckinridge book. One book just sort of has led to another. And it's been I've done more than 50 of them now, and it's just been a great ride all the way. I've loved every minute of it, I think.
Fascinating. Would you still continue to write? As you mentioned, your love of research will keep you engaged into the topic, or are you looking at some other narrower topics or broader topics to explore in a book format in the coming months or years?
Well, a man does not live by the Civil War alone. So I've done a number of books that were not Civil War books. I'm very interested in what's called the Old Southwest. That is the area of Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana in the early 1800s. And I've done a few books in that area. One about the Natchez Trace, which was one of the early highways that people got from north to south on. I did a book called 3 Roads to the Alamo, which was about the 3 primary sort of cultural heroes from the Alamo, William Barrett Travis, James Bowie, and the frontiersman David Crockett. And I'm getting started on doing a book on the Battle of New Orleans, which was, of course, the last engagement of the War of 1812 between the United States and Great Britain. In all these cases, much of what interests me is mythology, and then finding out what lies behind the mythology. And myth is really interesting to me because there's usually some glimmer of fact, but then we choose to reshape it to suit our needs somehow, so that in our history at least, our myth sort of presents the picture as we would like it to be rather than as it really was, which says a lot about us. So I've done a fair bit of that, but I'll still stick with the Civil War. I'm working on a cache of something like 700 letters between a Confederate general and his wife that were written from 1863 to 65, and I'm editing those now. And on the mythology front, my next book coming out this fall will be sort of a biography of a woman whose name I don't even know, because she used so many aliases. We don't really know what her name really was, but she's known to history as Loretta Velasquez. She claimed that she posed as a man and served throughout the Civil War in the Confederate Army as Captain Harry Buford. And she wrote a huge memoir of her wartime experiences that she published in 1876, which is all nonsense. It's all fiction. She made it up. But a lot of historians have nevertheless accepted that. And then she just seemingly disappeared in 1876, but I've managed to find another 50 years of her life in which she was truly a pioneer of female confidence artistry. She was a fraudster for 50 years after the Civil War, all over America, dreaming up big schemes and raising money from important people to back her schemes and then leaving town with the money. She's a very interesting character, thoroughly reprehensible. She's not somebody you'd admire, but that's been a great deal of fun trying to ferret out the facts of her life. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to stay at it for quite a while yet.
Going back to the book, would you like to have in summary some key points or highlights that you want the readers to take away from the book as they are going through the experience of reading the book?
I guess the takeaways from the book, first of all, would be that these were both basically good, honorable men who wanted the best for their countries and for themselves. Men, especially Lee, who were in some ways the victims of their times. Lee never wanted to resign his commission in the Army. He didn't like secession. He never really wanted to be a Confederate, but he felt he had no choice in the end when Virginia seceded. They were both men who always valued peace above war, even though they were both soldiers. And I would like to think that people in reading the book would realize that there are things to admire about both of them, and that despite this current sort of wave of mania about trying to expunge from our history and our landscape all reminders of the Confederacy, or of the Civil War for that matter, that there are good lessons to be learned from the examples set by Lee as well as by Grant, examples of heroic sacrifice, examples of patriotism, examples of self-sacrifice that ought to be just as valuable today as they were in their own times.
Thank you very much. We have been speaking with William Davis, the author of Crucible of Command. Thank you very much for your time and your comments.
It's been a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you.